Hi, I'm the History Guy. I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. 231,000 men and 10,000 women served with the United States Coast Guard during the Second World War. 1,918 of them would die in that service. The Coast Guard took its first casualty the day after Pearl Harbor when the Coast Guard manned transport Leonard Wood was bombed by the Japanese Navy in Singapore. And while the Coast Guard served many roles throughout the war, they never forgot their central role of search and rescue. 1,500 survivors of torpedo attacks were rescued by Coast Guard cutters, boats, and planes off the coasts of America during the war. 1,000 more were rescued by Coast Guardsmen who were performing their duty as convoy escort. But about 1,400 more were saved by Coast Guardsmen in a little-known flotilla that played a notable role in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The story of Rescue Flotilla One, the Matchbox Fleet, is a story that deserves to be remembered. After the Axis powers invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin started pressing for the Western Allies to open a second front in Western Europe. That would require the largest amphibious assault in world history, and it would take time to gather the strength to make such an attack. Two invasion plans for 1942, codenamed Operation Roundup and Operation Sledgehammer, were both deemed impractical and unlikely to succeed. And the disastrous Operation Rudder, better known as the Raid on Dieppe, demonstrated the high cost and impracticality of trying to take a well-defended port. The Allies instead opted to invade what they perceived to be a more vulnerable French North Africa in 1942. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt met in Washington, D.C. in May of 1943 and agreed that the invasion of Western Europe would occur in a year's time. The leaders discussed the initial plans for that invasion when they met again in Quebec City in Canada in August of that year. While they briefly considered an invasion through Norway, tentatively called Operation Jupiter, they settled on an invasion of France, calling the plan Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord was the code name for the overall Allied plan to establish a large-scale lodgment on the continent of Europe. Invading German-occupied Western Europe and establishing a second front would distract Hitler's armies, who were fighting the Soviets in the east, and offer a path for the liberation of Paris and the invasion of Germany itself. It was a massive operation, eventually including 39 divisions and more than 1 million troops. Overlord was a multifaceted plan that included major operations like Operation Point Blank, a portion of the Allied bomber offensive intended to set the stage for the invasion, and Operation Bodyguard, the complex deception plan designed to mislead the German High Command as to the timing and place of the invasion. But by far the most complex and challenging part of the plan was codenamed Operation Neptune, the Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy, France, that today is better known as D-Day. The scope of Operation Neptune was staggering. Nearly 7,000 vessels were involved. By comparison, the Great Spanish Armada of 1588 included 130 ships. Only some 850 ships had been used in the invasion of North Africa the year before. 160,000 Allied troops were landed by sea and parachute along those 50 miles of coastline on June 6th, and they were supported by 195,000 sailors manning the massive invasion fleet. And Winston Churchill realized that some of those men were going to wind up in the water. Purportedly some weeks before the invasion, he lamented to President Roosevelt that the invasion fleet had no rescue flotilla. But with all of the resources already committed, how could they put together such a flotilla in such a short period of time? FDR responded, "We already have such a group, the United States Coast Guard." The Coast Guard already had a significant role in Operation Neptune, showing their skill at small boat handling by operating many of the landing craft that ferried the landing force under fire to the beaches. But of course, the Coast Guard had traditionally played the role of rescuing people at sea. Vice Admiral Russell R. Weish, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, suggested that the coastal patrol boats being used for anti-submarine service along the U.S. East Coast were the best fit for the proposed flotilla. 60 83-foot cutters from what was called the Matchbox Fleet were selected and transported piggyback on freighters to the UK, where they were formed into Rescue Flotilla One, based at Poole, England, and modified for service as rescue craft. The 83-foot cutter had been designed in 1940. Contracted to the Wheeler Shipyard in Brooklyn, New York, the first order of 40 cutters entered service in 1941, and by the end of 1944, a total of 230 were produced for the Coast Guard. They were designed for coastal convoy escort, anti-submarine duty, and search and rescue. The 83-foot, 2-inch-long vessels were wooden-hulled, and their two screws were powered by two inline 8-cylinder Stirling Viking II gasoline engines, each of which produced 600 horsepower, allowing a top speed of 20 knots. They were commonly called matchboxes because of the dangerous combination of gasoline and wood. They had a displacement of 76 tons, a beam of 16 foot 2 inches, and a draft of 5 foot 4 inches. In normal World War II configuration, they mounted a 20mm gun aft and depth charge racks, although the racks were removed for the role in Operation Neptune. The normal crew complement was 13. The 60 cutters of Rescue Flotilla One had their Coast Guard call signs removed, and for the sake of communication simplicity, were renamed CGC 1 through 60. 30 were assigned to the American sector, Omaha and Utah beaches, and 30 to the British sector, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Although the Coast Guard operated several vessels on D-Day, Rescue Flotilla One represented nearly 2/3 of those. Their job was straightforward, as Flotilla veteran Jack Hamlin explained. Be nothing, but just be a lifeguard, he said. We were not there to destroy anybody, to kill anybody. We were there to just do rescue operations. And that's what we did. At Poole, the crews had received special training, including extensive first aid training. It would prove critical on June 6th. Their task was dangerous. They were accompanying the assault boats and would have to brave enemy fire and obstacles many times on their rescue runs. The seas were rough, and the tiny boats had to maneuver around the larger craft. CGC-16, nicknamed the homing pigeon, got to work early, picking up survivors from a landing craft disabled by the choppy seas in the assembly area before the landing even began. As the crew neared Omaha Beach, they rushed to the rescue of the crew of an anti-aircraft ship, which had been destroyed by German fire. No sooner had they pulled those survivors on board when a German shell destroyed a nearby patrol boat. Rushing to their rescue, the tiny cutter, intended to carry no more than 20 wounded, was crammed with 90 rescued men. They returned them to the hospital ship and went back to the beach. One of the CGC-16's crew climbed aboard a burning transport loaded with ammunition to rescue a sailor whose legs had been severed by a shell. He rescued the man, and the craft sunk less than 2 minutes later. Many of the men were seriously injured, and the first aid was left up to CGC-16's cook, who applied tourniquets and administered morphine from the ship's medical locker. By the end of the day, the crew of CGC-16 had pulled 126 men from the English Channel, the largest number saved by any of the Coast Guard Matchbox fleet that day. For their heroism, the crew of CGC-16 were awarded the Bronze Star. CGC-1 came upon a sunken British landing craft 2 miles offshore. They pulled 24 soldiers and 4 Royal Navy sailors from the channel. The Coast Guardsmen had to jump overboard and tie lines to the freezing survivors because they were too cold to help themselves aboard. Later, CGC-1 rescued 19 survivors from another sunken landing craft, 14 of whom were fellow Coast Guardsmen. CGC-34 rescued another 32 British soldiers and seamen in the British sector. The process could be slow. Many of the men being rescued were injured, and the soldiers were weighted down with heavy packs. It took time and all the crew's strength to carefully lift them on board while under fire. The boats had to carry survivors back to hospital ships 10 miles offshore. In the choppy waters and loaded with casualties, the cutters could barely make 15 knots. And the cutters saw their share of fire that day. CGC-29 was in the British sector when a marauding German torpedo boat attacked a group of landing craft. Other escorts chased the torpedo boat as the crew of the cutter saved 14 men from the craft that had been torpedoed. A group of 4 cutters was nearly fired upon by the British, who had mistaken them for German torpedo boats. CGC-53 came under fire from a shore battery as they pulled men from a swamped landing craft. The battleship HMS Rodney opened fire, silencing the German guns. The crew of CGC-35 received the British Distinguished Service Cross for steering their wooden cutter through a sea of burning petrol to rescue the crew of a landing craft that had been blown up by a direct hit. And yet they did their jobs. By the end of the day, the Matchbox fleet had saved over 400 soldiers and sailors along the Normandy beachhead. Despite often being in the line of fire, with many of the cutters taking damage, Rescue Flotilla One did not lose a single boat, nor a single Coast Guardsman. The Coast Guard played a vital role in Operation Neptune, operating many naval ships, from large landing craft to the small Higgins boats that were dropping the soldiers at the shore. 4 landing craft ships operated by the Coast Guard were sunk in Operation Neptune, and several other Coast Guard vessels were damaged. It was the largest loss of Coast Guard vessels in the history of the service. 15 Coast Guardsmen died in the Normandy landings. Coast Guard Commander Quentin R. Walsh both helped to design the Mulberry harbors that transformed the Normandy beaches into giant ports, and also played a central role in capturing the French port of Cherbourg and returning it to service. He received the U.S. Distinguished Service Cross. Rescue Flotilla One continued in service off the coast of France until the unit was finally disbanded in February of 1945. Some of the cutters had been in the assault zones more than 89 days and had made the round trip between the Normandy beaches and Great Britain more than 30 times. In their period of operation, they were credited with rescuing 1,437 people. They were continuing the Coast Guard's long tradition of saving lives, albeit on a beach under fire thousands of miles from home. But that is the nature of the men and women who serve in the United States' oldest continuing seagoing service, whose motto is Semper Paratus, always ready. This is, perhaps, one of the single most well-known photographs of the American participation in the Second World War. Taken the morning of June 6, 1944, by U.S. Coast Guard Chief Photographer's Mate Robert F. Sargent, the photo is entitled, "Into the Jaws of Death." The men in the photo are members of Company E of the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division. The 1st Infantry Division, the Fighting First, is the longest continuously serving division in the United States Army. Constituted in 1917, their service in the Great War was extraordinary. 5 members of the division received medals of honor. In the Second World War, in 1942, they were among the first troops to land in North Africa. George Patton specifically requested that they be part of the invasion of Sicily in 1943, and in June of 1944, they were once again the tip of the spear, as the Allies planned to invade Fortress Europe. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The 16th Infantry Regiment predates the 1st Infantry Division, and its service can almost serve as a list of the American Army's most deadly engagements. The modern regiment was first constituted on May 4, 1861, as the 1st Battalion of the 11th U.S. Infantry. They fought in some of the hardest fights of the U.S. Civil War, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Cold Harbor. They were at Appomattox in April of 1865, where they helped to collect the arms from Lee's defeated army. They became the 16th Regiment after reorganization in 1869. They served throughout the West in the Indian Wars. Company K guarded Geronimo after his capture. They helped to take Kettle Hill in the Spanish-American War and fought in 27 engagements in the Philippine-American War that followed. In 1912, they joined General Pershing on the fruitless expedition to capture Pancho Villa. In the Great War, they were among the first 4 American regiments to land in France. They marched through Paris on July 4, 1917, to help improve French morale. They were the first American unit to fight and endure casualties in the war. In the bloody fighting, the regiment earned its motto, "No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first." 97 members of the regiment earned Distinguished Service Crosses in the war. It is, then, no wonder that the regiment would see extensive and distinguished service in the Second World War. According to the regimental history, the regiment shipped out for England in April of 1942, and on 26 October 1942, the regiment left Scotland by ship, which, as part of a large invasion force, headed to French Morocco. Despite their years of service, this would be the first amphibious landing for the 16th. Lieutenant Everett Booth recalled in the 1995 book, No Mission Too Difficult, Old Buddies of the 1st Division Tell All About World War II, "I remember one bright moonlit night when I saw the ships were moving out. This was unusual, since I normally would be docked in the bay. We sailed into the Atlantic and down towards Africa." On the boat was Private John Joseph Pinder, Jr., born in Keys Rock, Pennsylvania on June 6, 1912. The Harris, Pennsylvania Patriot News reported in 2018 that Pinder had been valedictorian of his high school class and had gone on to study radio communications at the National Radio Institute in Washington. His dream, however, was the big leagues. Dick Thompson of the Society for American Baseball Research noted that in 1941, Pinder had pitched for 17 wins and 11 losses with a 2.93 ERA in the minor leagues. He was looking forward to the 1942 season, but Thompson writes, his dream of reaching the major leagues would never be realized. He was drafted in January 1942, and became a radio technician for the headquarters company of the 16th Infantry Regiment. They fought in the Tunisian campaign, including the difficult battle at Kasserine Pass, where they played a role in helping to stabilize the front. The regimental history notes, for its actions at Kasserine, the regiment was decorated with the Croix de Guerre by the French government, and received the first presidential unit citation for its actions near Matur. In Tunisia, they were joined by Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith. Born July 1, 1917, Monteith served in the Corps of Cadets at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Drafted in October of 1941, Monteith applied for Officers' Candidacy School while in basic training. He was commissioned a second lieutenant on June 20, 1942. In April of 1943, he requested transfer to the 1st Infantry Division. He was assigned to Company L, but missed most of the fighting as the Africa Corps surrendered shortly after his arrival. The regiment faced more difficulty in Sicily. The regimental history writes, next came Sicily. Shortly before 0100 hours on 10 July 1943, the first wave of the 16th Infantry boarded landing craft for the assault on that island. After achieving a relatively bloodless hold on the beachhead in the darkness, the regiment pushed into the hills beyond. There, the regiment was soon hit hard with an armored counterattack by German tanks. Despite numerous enemy tanks and reinforcements, the 16th Infantry desperately held on by receiving assistance from the heavy guns of the U.S. Navy and the timely arrival of the regiment's cannon company. Lieutenant Booth received the Silver Star for actions in Sicily. The citation says, while manning a forward observation post, Lieutenant Booth noted the imperative need for more support of his organization's left flank Communication with his company and battalion command post having failed, he fearlessly proceeded under intense enemy fire from his observation post to obtain the required support. Although twice forced back, he gallantly persisted and successfully accomplished his mission. Pinder was awarded the Bronze Star for courageously remaining at an exposed observation post on Sicily in July 1943 to transmit valuable tactical information to a regimental command post. During this time, his position was under severe artillery and mortar bombardment. On September 3rd, Monteith received a field promotion to first lieutenant. After Sicily, the Fighting First was not sent to Italy. Rather, they were shipped back to England. The Allies were training for the invasion of France, and their most experienced division would be there. Monteith wrote a letter to his family from England on New Year's Day, 1944. "I would not change if I were given the chance, even to have some easy job in the rear area. Of course, I can't say that I should ever be lucky enough to have a son that I would want him to go through something like this, but if events forced him, I would want him to prove himself. As for the 1st Division, every time I look at the shoulder insignia, the Red One, I get a thrill. There is no better fighting unit in the world. When the Germans were confident of victory on several occasions and all circumstances were against the first, the men rose to the occasion and hurled them back in great confusion and disorder. There is a great feeling of satisfaction that one gets with oneself. I would not change." The Big Red One would need everything they had for the upcoming battle. The South Carolina Daily Gazette wrote in 2004, "Among the many Allied military units storming the Normandy coast on June 6, 1944, was the 16th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division. Its members faced a particularly daunting task. As part of the first wave of the largest amphibious assault in history, the regiment was assigned to clear the Omaha Beach landing sectors codenamed Easy Red and Fox Green. They knew it was a difficult assignment." The Gazette writes, "That steak dinner the night before D-Day," recalled Charles Hangsturfer, then a captain in the 16th Regiment, "was just like they would give a convicted murderer his last meal on the evening of his execution." There was difficulty from the start. Virginia Tech magazine explains the Big Red One boarded ships near Dorchester, Dorset, England, June 1st to 4th, 1944, and sailed the evening of June 5th to invade France the following day. As they approached the coast of Normandy, they ran into problems. According to historical records of the 16th Infantry, heavy seas, numerous underwater obstacles, and intense enemy fire destroyed many craft and caused high casualties even before the assault battalions reached shore. Most supporting weapons, including DD tanks, were swamped. The Daily Gazette writes, "The troops learned upon landing that their arrival was later than expected, and often far from its intended destination." D-Day was a massive operation, but the sector called Omaha stood out. The Imperial War Museum explains, "Troops from the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions landed on Omaha Beach on 6 June. Omaha was the most heavily defended of the assault areas, and casualties were higher than on any other beach. Preliminary Allied air and naval bombardments failed to knock out strong defensive points along the coast, and the Americans had difficulty clearing the beach obstacles. The experienced German 352nd Infantry Division was taking part in anti-invasion training in the area and was able to reinforce coastal defense units." Ed Lembarski, a sergeant in F Company, recalled, "There were so many bullets zeroing in on the first wave that it was impossible to cross the beach. Being in that first wave was like committing suicide." Booth recalled, "They didn't get us very close to the sandy beach. I tell you, I think they wanted to get rid of us as soon as they could." Pinder, then a technician 5th grade, the equivalent of a corporal, was carrying his 80 pounds of radio equipment. The website of the Department of Defense writes, "An artillery shell landed near Pinder's boat and tore holes in it, killing some men immediately and causing chaos among those left behind. As the vessel began to fill with water, its ramp opened to let the men out about 100 yards offshore. Devastating machine gun and artillery fire rained down on them as they tried to wade their way to land in waist-deep water. Many were killed before they even got to shore." As Pinder left the boat, the department writes, "He was only a few yards from his boat when he was hit twice by enemy fire, with one hit tearing into the left side of his face. Witnesses said Pinder continued forward, holding the equipment in one arm and the flesh from his face with the other hand. As he had in Sicily, Pinder understood the importance of communications, and he did his job without regard for the enemy fire." The department explains, "He knew setting up communications was crucial to directing naval and air support that could take out the German installations decimating the shoreline. It was the only way they could survive the ordeal. Pinder delivered the radio to the shore. He then turned around and went back into the fire-swept surf to gather more parts and equipment." A medal citation reads, "Refusing to take cover afforded or to accept medical attention for his wounds, Technician 5th grade Pinder, though terribly weakened by loss of blood and in fierce pain, on 3 occasions went into the fire-swept surf to salvage communication equipment. He recovered many vital parts and equipment, including another workable radio. On the 3rd trip, he was again hit, suffering machine gun bullet wounds to his legs. Still, this valiant soldier would not stop for rest or medical attention. Remaining exposed to heavy enemy fire, growing steadily weaker, he aided in establishing the vital radio communication on the beach. The indomitable courage and personal bravery of Technician 5th Grade Pinder was a magnificent inspiration to the men with whom he served. John Monteith's Company L was facing its own difficulties. Aaron B. Jones, a sergeant in his company, recalls, "When we hit the beach, the air was thick with machine gun, rifle, and shell fire. Lieutenant Monteith brought his men together and faced the first obstacle, layers of heavy barbed wire. After selecting a place where it could be blown open, he led men with a Bangalore torpedo in blasting the wire open. Beyond this were 2 minefields, and he led the way through these. The field was traversed by machine gun fire from 2 enemy emplacements and from a pillbox, and when the men took cover, he stood studying the situation and then ran back to the beach. On the beach were 2 tanks, buttoned up and blind because of heavy machine gun fire that was directed on them. He walked through all that fire to bang on the sides of the tanks and instruct the men inside to follow him. Then, walking in front, he led the tanks into the pillbox, where they put it out of action. He then led his men against 2 machine gun positions and knocked them out, and then set up a defensive position to hold until more units could be brought up from the beach." A medal citation reads, "First Lieutenant Monteith landed with the initial assault waves on the coast of France under heavy enemy fire. Without regard to his own personal safety, he continually moved up and down the beach, reorganizing men for further assault. He then led the assault over a narrow protective ledge and across the flat exposed terrain to the comparative safety of a cliff. But the company came under a new attack, and once again Jimmy Monteith rose to the occasion." Jones recalled, "In that sector, the enemy was not fighting from fixed positions, but was moving around in the hedgerows and setting up automatic weapons. In this manner, a fairly large group started an attack on the position and set up machine guns on the flanks and rear. The Germans yelled for us to surrender because we were surrounded. Lieutenant Monteith didn't answer, but moved towards the sound of their voices and launched a rifle grenade at them from 20 yards, knocking out the machine gun position. Even with a larger force, the Germans couldn't break through our position, so they set up 2 machine guns and started spraying the hedgerow. Lieutenant Monteith got a squad of riflemen to open up on the machine gun on the right flank. Under cover of the fire, he sneaked up on the gun and threw hand grenades, which knocked out that position." Historian Pete Lamb wrote that Monteith's actions were the most important, for he single-handedly turned defeat into victory on that bullet-swept, corpse-strewn beachhead called Omaha. The Daily Gazette notes that the 16th took nearly 1,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, nearly a third of the regiment. Among those was John Pinder. His citation, he was one of 4 men to receive the Medal of Honor on June 6th, says, "This dauntless soldier was hit for the 3rd time and killed. It was his 32nd birthday. When told of his nephew's death, his uncle wrote, 'I won't believe he's gone until this mess is over and he doesn't return in body to Valley View.'" And Jimmy Monteith, his Medal of Honor citation reads, "When the enemy succeeded in completely surrounding First Lieutenant Monteith and his unit, and while leading the fight out of the situation, First Lieutenant Monteith was killed by enemy fire. When he was told of his brother's death, Bob Monteith, serving in the Navy, wrote his mother, 'This will be the hardest letter I have ever written, for there just aren't words that will tell you how I feel, or the things that are in my heart tonight. No mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great. Duty first.'" The Gazette-Journal writes, despite the heavy losses and powerful German defense, as the day wore on it became clear that the 16th Infantry Regiment had secured a foothold on Omaha Beach. On July 2nd, General Eisenhower spoke to the men of the regiment. "I'm not going to make a long speech, but this simple little ceremony gives me an opportunity to come over here and, through you, say thanks. You are the finest regiment in our army. I know your record from the day you landed in North Africa and through Sicily. I'm beginning to think that your regiment is a sort of Praetorian Guard, which goes along with me and gives me luck." But of course, securing the beachhead was nowhere near the end of the fighting. After the beach came the hedgerow country. After that came Belgium, where they helped the 1st Division eliminate 6 German divisions. In November, they had the bloody fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, where Everett Booth received the Distinguished Service Award. In December, they defended Elsenborn Ridge in the German counterattack called the Battle of the Bulge. The 16th fought through to the bitter end. The regimental history writes, in 443 days of combat, the regiment lost 1,250 officers and men killed, an additional 6,278 wounded or missing in action. Men of the regiment received 4 Medals of Honor, 87 Distinguished Service Awards, and 1,926 Silver Stars. In a letter home to his family, Jimmy Monteith once said, "People forget the soldiers that fight their battles for them in a matter of hours." 81 years after his death, it is up to us to remember. It is June 8th, 2020, and 76 years ago, young men fighting in France referred to this as D-Day +2. The action was still quite hot 2 days after the Allied invasion of Normandy began, and some troops that were just disembarking then were still coming under fire from German positions. In the British sector, the British 6th Airborne Division was facing a dogged counterattack by the German 346th Infantry Division. And behind Omaha Beach, men of the U.S. 2nd and 5th Rangers and 116th Infantry Regiment were fighting against dogged opposition to rescue the remnants of 3 companies of Rangers that had been cut off from support. It was a day of action. It was a day of losses. It was a day that would culminate with one of those million acts of bravery that were such a part of the largest amphibious invasion in history, and that deserves to be remembered. Of the 5 beaches assaulted on D-Day, the 5-mile stretch in the middle, called Omaha, assigned to the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, turned out to be the deadliest. There are many reasons why the sector, sandwiched between the American Landing and Utah Beach on the Allied right flank and the British-Canadian sector, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches on the left, was deadliest. But a good part of it had to do with the German 352nd Infantry Division. Allied intelligence had determined that the crescent-shaped beach was defended by a reinforced battalion of the 716th Static Infantry Division. The 716th was mobilized for occupation duties. An estimated half the division were non-Germans, men impressed into service from German-occupied countries. Many of the German troops were elderly conscripts. The division had been stripped of its veteran troops who had been sent to fight the Russians in the east. The men of the 716th had never seen combat. But Allied intelligence was wrong. Omaha Beach was not defended by the 716th Static Infantry Division, but by the 352nd Infantry Division. The 352nd was a new division, formed in November 1943 and originally intended for combat on the Eastern Front. The threat of invasion by the Western Allies has instead sent the division to France to defend the Atlantic Wall. The 352nd was a mix. Nearly half the division were recruits, some just 17 years old. But of the division's 12,000 men, some 6,800 were experienced combat troops drawn from divisions that had been disbanded on the Eastern Front. The 352nd was a substantially more experienced and dangerous unit than the 716th, but somehow Allied intelligence had missed the shift, which had occurred in March. The Allied attack on Omaha Beach was divided between the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. The U.S. 1st Infantry Division was one of the American Army's most veteran. The division had fought across North Africa and an invasion of Sicily before being sent to England to prepare for the invasion of France. But the 29th was untested. Formed in February 1941, the division had shipped to England in October 1942 and had spent the next 20 months training for the invasion. The men of the 29th were itching for a fight, and its 116th Infantry Regiment would be among the first to see that fight, landing on the west side of Omaha Beach, with the men of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Infantry Regiment landing on the east. Among the men of the 29th was 28-year-old Frank D. Paragoy. Born in Virginia in 1916, Paragoy had joined the Virginia National Guard in 1931. He was only 15, he lied about his age. In the enlistment, his name had been misspelled Paragory with an extra R. He had been awarded the Soldier's Medal, the highest award for bravery a soldier can receive in peacetime, for saving a fellow soldier from drowning during a beach patrol in 1941. By D-Day, he was a technical sergeant with Company K of the 116th Infantry Regiment. A friend, PFC Felix Branham, said of him, "He never tried to raise his voice. If he had a temper, I never knew it. He never tried to be James Cagney like most of us did." The men of the 116th would also be joined by 2 battalions of Army Rangers. The men of the Rangers were carefully selected and arduously trained. They had training in things like cliff scaling and rappelling, as well as extensive assault training preparing to attack heavily defended beaches. The Rangers were given responsibility to attack a promontory called Point de Hawk. The heavily fortified position was the highest point between Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. 3 companies of the 2nd Rangers were to land first, landing at the base of the cliff before daylight and using ladders to scale the cliff and take the position. If they were successful in capturing the point, they would be followed by the remaining 2 companies of the 2nd Rangers and the entirety of the 5th Ranger Battalion. Their goal was to destroy the guns and capture the casemates so that they could not be used by the Germans, and then to move inland to the village of Grand Camp. If that first attack failed, the remainders of the 2nd Rangers and the entirety of the 5th Ranger Battalion would instead land on Omaha Beach behind the 116th. They would try to move uphill and take Point de Hawk via an overland attack. The initial assault didn't go as planned. Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Rangers boarded their landing craft at 4:45 a.m. But in the rough seas, one of the boats carrying 22 men capsized, and all but one of the Rangers aboard drowned. In the choppy water, the boats drifted off course, but by the time the error was corrected, the attack was 40 minutes behind, and the remaining Rangers, having gotten no signal, had already been sent to land on Omaha Beach. The Rangers took Pointe du Hoc and tracked down and disabled the guns there, which had been moved, but now they were alone, cut off from support, and the Germans began engaging in determined counterattacks. They had trouble getting through by radio, and when they did, they were told that no reinforcements were available. Their relief would have to fight their way up from Omaha Beach. But things were also not going as planned on the beach. Troops began landing on Omaha Beach at 6:30. The troops of the 1st and 29th Divisions were supported by Sherman DD, or duplex drive tanks, specially modified with canvas floating screens to allow them to move through shallow surf. The plan was for the initial landing force to have cleared the beach obstacles in approximately 2 hours, allowing larger ships to bring in reinforcements, for the troops to move inland, with some hooking up with the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. But everything was a mess. Rough surf swamped both boats and the wallowing DD tanks. 27 of the initial 29 DD tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion swamped while waiting to shore. The boats that were not swamped were pushed by heavy current and could not find their landing areas because reference points were obscured by smoke. Troops were scattered, missing their landing points and leaving gaps between units. When boats did manage to land troops, many of them had lost their equipment, trying not to drown in the surf, and soldiers were seasick from the choppy ride. Soldiers were often released on sandbars up to 200 yards out and had to move through water up to neck deep at a walking pace, under fire. When they got ashore, they found out that the low clouds had meant that the pre-attack bombardment from the air had been ineffective, leaving the beach defenses undamaged. Captain John Rand of the 5th Rangers described the experience on the beach. And the rifle fire and the machine gun fire was just incessant as it cracked over our heads, as it hit into the breakwaters, as it churned up the turf, as it banged into the road next to us. And it was one horrible noise after another, with a lot of nasty little noises in between. Radios were lost or broken, companies were disorganized, and many leaderless. Some had taken 50% casualties before anyone had made dry land. The engineers set to clear the beach obstacles were likewise scattered, trying to do their work under fire, without infantry or tanks to cover them, and having lost much of their equipment. The second wave of landing craft were hit as hard as the first. The first wave was not able to produce covering fire, and the incoming tide was now covering beach obstacles that were supposed to have been removed, causing havoc to the small landing boats. Vehicles coming ashore made easy targets on the narrow beach. Progress came slowly, and where troops made it off the beach, they were pinned down by machine gun nests inland. The objective of connecting the beachheads was not met. The foothold was tenuous. 15 men of Frank Paraguay's K Company were killed in a minefield at the crest of the seawall. The men of Company K spent the night near Verville Road, far from their initial objectives, and more than 6 miles from the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. The landings that day had gone so badly that Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, had considered evacuating Omaha Beach. Lieutenant Horace Henderson of the 6th Engineer Special Brigade landed the morning of June 7th, and he said, "The beach was literally covered with the bodies of American soldiers, wearing the blue and gray patches of the 29th Infantry Division." On top of the point, a single platoon of the 5th Rangers had managed to sneak through to reinforce the Rangers. The planned relief would not make it to them that day. The Rangers faced counterattacks all night, and by morning had been driven back to a narrow strip, about 200 yards deep and 500 yards wide. Less than 100 Rangers were fit for combat by morning. They were out of food, low on ammunition. They would likely have been overrun were it not for fire support from ships offshore, and help was still a long time coming. Counterattacks the morning of the 7th compelled commanders of the 29th to keep 4 of the 6 Ranger companies behind to hold the perimeter. The remainder, including Captain Rand, tried to get to the Rangers on the point, accompanied by 10 tanks. They made it within 1,000 yards of the point, but artillery forced the tanks to retire. The Rangers called in their own artillery, but a rumor of a counterattack finally halted the advance. The Rangers on the point had to spend another night of counterattacks, wearing down men who had not slept for 2 days. By morning of June 8th, the Germans were preparing for a final counterattack, assuming the Rangers would finally be overrun. But relief was on its way, starting with the bombardment of the German position with 140 5-inch rounds from the Gleaves-class destroyer USS Ellison. But there was more difficulty. The Rangers had been fighting with captured German weapons, and the men of the 116th, hearing the distinctive noise of the German guns, attacked. 4 Rangers were killed and 3 injured before a recognition flare stopped the friendly fire. Pointe du Hoc was secured, and the Rangers finally relieved. But the Utah and Omaha beachheads were still not connected, and the men of the 116th and the Rangers were still fighting to achieve objectives that they were supposed to have met on the first day. They still had work to do on D-Day +2. Supported by tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion, they had been sent not just to relieve the Rangers at the point, but to push through and take the German defenses at the village of Grand Camp. The village of Grand Camp was some 2 miles away and situated on a hill that was covered with defensive fortifications. The approach by the coastal highway led across a small valley with flooded areas on both sides of the road, and the enemy strongpoints west of the valley had extensive fields of fire from higher ground. Grand Camp would be the location of some of the most bitter fighting on D-Day +2. Stopped by the fire from the hill, the Americans called in an hour-long barrage from the cruiser, HMS Glasgow. The German positions had to be taken in fierce fighting that some of the Rangers described as more severe than the fighting on D-Day. But the battalion was struck by machine gun fire from a particularly strong position. They tried to take it out with tank fire and artillery fire, but nothing worked until Frank Peregoy decided to take action. He worked his way up the hill some 200 yards under fire until he found one of the German trenches. Private Brennan described Frank's action. Peregoy stood up and, firing his rifle from his hip, reached the trench and leaped into it, and with fixed bayonet, he fired, pausing to toss hand grenades. An official account said he encountered a squad of enemy riflemen. He fearlessly attacked them with his hand grenades and bayonet, killed 8 and forced 3 to surrender. He led the prisoners out of the trench and delivered them to another man from his platoon, and then he jumped back into the trench. Branham said after what appeared to be an eternity, he appeared again. This time, he had 32 Germans. Peregoy had moved down the trench and single-handedly captured the Germans defending it, attacking them with hand grenades until the machine gunners there surrendered. His action cleared the way for the battalion to move forward, although more bitter hand-to-hand fighting was needed to secure the town. Barnum said, after some heavy action and the loss of many friends, it was in our hands by 9 p.m. The German defenses on the hill outside the village of Grand Camp were the Germans' strongest position between the Omaha and Utah beaches, and when they and the artillery batteries in the nearby village of Maisie were taken, German resistance in the area largely collapsed. 76 years ago today, on D-Day, +2. The men of the 116th were put to work mopping up German stragglers, and on the 11th were placed into the reserve so that they could reorder and reorganize following their losses at D-Day. For his action, Frank Peregoy was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "The extraordinary gallantry and aggressiveness displayed by Tech Sergeant Peregoy are exemplary of the highest tradition of the armed forces." He wouldn't live to receive the medal. The 116th was thrown back into action on June 13th after just 2 days' rest. The following day, June 14th, 1944, Frank Peregoy, while trying to single-handedly take a machine gun in the dangerous Bocage country, was killed in action. His remains are interred at the American Battle Monuments Cemetery in Normandy. 75 years after his death, a road that was named in his honor still bears the misspelling of his surname that came when he enlisted in 1931. After the battle, some came to question whether the attack on Pointe du Hoc was necessary. The casemates were unfinished. The artillery pieces were in no position to threaten the beaches. But regardless of that controversy, scaling the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc is considered to have been an act of exceptional bravery. On June 6, 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the day, President Ronald Reagan said of the boys of Pointe du Hoc, "Strengthened by their courage, heartened by their valor, and born by their memory, let us continue to stand for the ideals for which they lived and died." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.